Hello, everybody. It's Merlin here, and I'm going to be doing a special edition of the MerlinCast as a Patreon request. This one comes from Peter, one of my biggest donators, and it was regarding around the time of Halloween. Now, obviously, this one's a little bit delayed just because the last couple days have been kind of busy, but Halloween was recent, and I hope that everyone did have a good Halloween. The question from Peter was essentially having heard about all the really popular horror films like the Nightmare on Elm Streets and the Friday the 13th, etc., what films would I consider to be kind of underrated classics that just don't get talked about enough, or as much as some of the really iconic ones? And I thought that was a really good question. And I also thought that since there was kind of a lot, I didn't necessarily do a top 10, I just did kind of a couple films that I thought of in no particular order that I just wanted to sort of talk about in significant detail. So, the first one that I picked was Phantasm. Now, Phantasm is one of my favorite horror movies. In fact, one of the interesting things about Phantasm is, unlike pretty much any of the other slasher or monster series of films that are out there, the Tall Man and his Phantasm movies have one thing regarding them that I can't say about any of those other franchises. And that's that, at least upon my memory, I like all the sequels. Like, I haven't seen the newest one, Phantasm Ravager, though I am planning on it at some point in the near future. I like the original, and I like the other ones as well. Essentially, if you guys don't know the Phantasm, basically it takes place in the 1970s when it was filmed, and it follows this young boy as he's kind of investigating these strange events in this small town regarding this mortuary guy who appears like death, but may in fact be an alien or an interdimensional being or something. And what he does with the people that he kills is he kind of morphs them into these little dwarf creatures and takes them to some other weird dimension for some nefarious purpose. Now, admittedly, this one is not as underrated as some of the other ones that I'll be talking about, but when you kind of put it up against a lot of the really iconic stuff, it comes up in conversations among people that really like horror movies and are well versed in them, but it's like never the first thing that's mentioned. I think that it really deserves a little more credit. It's a really frightening and fun film. And it's kind of one of those ones that I really admire for just how low budget it is. There's just a lot of really cool tricks there in terms of editing and makeup work and prop work and special effects. It's pretty cool. This next film I'm talking about is called They. It's from the late 90s, I believe, and I will confess I only ever saw this one once, but it had a pretty good effect on me. It actually has a pretty big similarity to another film I'll be talking about next, but essentially all it is a couple people seem to discover that there might be some demonic entities that kind of live on the fringes of our world and might attack us. Pretty basic concept, but the thing about this movie that I really like is how all of the terror pretty much comes from conversations between people. Throughout the entire movie, you never see the monster until for like a split second at the last frame. I can't think of any other film that had that much build-up. Now, I don't know if this is like the best made film ever, but I thought it was competent, and I just really think that's a really unique aspect, since the creepiness and the fear is based pretty much entirely on the atmosphere and how the characters react to things, as opposed to us actually seeing something. And it's kind of one of those things that's sort of Lovecraftian in the sense that it's something that can never be fully described, only in vague terms, because after all, one of the most frightening things is the unknown. And at that point, I think towards the end of the film, they knew that they couldn't really show us something that would be as frightening as what we could imagine. Though it would have been fun to see him try, and we do kind of get to see an element of it, and it's frightening enough. So it's definitely one I think that's severely underrated, that at least needs to be checked out a little more. Now, this other one is certainly not as underrated, but it's definitely, once again, not talked about as much as some of the big horror movies, and you could argue whether or not exactly it's a horror or it's sort of a thriller, but there are enough images in the film that are just so terribly horrific that I would agree. I would agree to define it as a horror movie, and that's Jacob's Ladder. As far as movies that have terrified me go, feeling that you're losing your mind, feeling like you're seeing terrifying visions, just some of the most nightmarish creatures ever produced on film are in this movie, and that's kind of its claim to fame. Really, I mean that's the only thing about this movie that is really horrific is basically it follows this guy who's a Vietnam veteran who's just trying to deal with his past. He keeps getting flashbacks. Basically, some bad things happened to him in Vietnam. We don't know exactly what, and so his flashbacks of what happened to him are kind of fusing with these elements that might be connected to some demonic beings from hell or some other terrible evil. So it's kind of supernatural, it's kind of psychological, and there is a little bit of a twist at the end which might kind of subdue it a little bit. But the thing is, the atmosphere of the film and some of those scenes with some of these beings, these deformed beings, performing these terrible acts, it's just some of the most frightening things that you'll ever see on film. It's truly terrifying. But on that level, it's also a pretty good allegory for a lot of other things. In any sense, though, for capturing that feeling of madness and just being out of control, it's definitely one of the best for that alone. Now, the next one is going to be a little bit less underrated, but definitely more underrated than some other things. That would be the original Evil Dead. Now, I know people listening to this are going to be like, really, Merlin? Evil Dead as an underrated horror movie? To which I would respond, yeah, well, listen to me. Everybody in my circle of friends, and anybody that you'll ever run into, what do they talk about when it comes up to Evil Dead, alright? When it comes to Evil Dead, they talk about Evil Dead 2. Evil Dead 2, Evil Dead 2, Evil Dead 2, and sometimes Army of Darkness. Evil Dead 1, the original Evil Dead, almost never gets mentioned because it has been totally overshadowed by Evil Dead 2, which is essentially more of a parody of the first film, which, while it does have some creepy moments, is much more of a horror comedy than a straight horror movie, which I think is kind of unfair to the original movie which started the whole franchise. I don't know what it is about me, but I guess for some reason I really respect the low-budget grittiness that comes with some of these first films for directors, because this one, El Mariachi, and the original Mad Max are all like my favorites of these trilogies of films. And I guess it's just because they're so low budget, I think it gives them more character, but the thing about the first Evil Dead is it's just much more of a horror movie. And it has some terrifying visuals, and I guess you could argue about whether or not, one of them's better than the other. I think all the films certainly have their good qualities, but I think that Evil Dead 2 is just honestly a little overrated. I never liked it as much as the first film. So maybe that's where it comes from. I think it's a very well done one, but I think it's just unfair what it's done to the original. The next one I'm going to be talking about is another one of my favorites. It's actually one that I discovered in the not too distant past. It's Troll Hunter. Now, this is my favorite found footage horror movie. And I know that when people hear found footage, they kind of groan, and they're like, oh man, it's so overdone. And yes, it is. And it's difficult to really do it, and do it well, and make it make sense. But this one is just so fantastic. Like, I cannot undersell how excellent this movie is. In fact, it's one of my favorites. Like, in terms of fake documentaries, this is pretty good, and I will admit that it definitely has more elements of humor and drama, and it's not necessarily just about the scares, though when it does get scary, it can get quite scary. I guess the movie is a little more fun for a horror movie, perhaps, but it's just so grand in creating this story. And you have these characters which are grounded, and it seems incredibly realistic because they kind of follow this guy who is probably just an amateur actor, and it really adds a whole human element to it that really sucks you in. And the slow build-up of this fake kind of situation is really cool as well. But I think the thing that really sells this movie for me is that while I am not the biggest fan of CGI, I believe that when it is used properly, it can be fantastic. And this movie is, relatively speaking, probably a lower budget film than some of the bigger budget ones. And yet, they managed to put most of their money that they had probably into this CGI, and it is some of the coolest looking stuff. The trolls are so convincing and awesome looking. It's great, and it builds up to this final battle with this giant one. It's fantastic. Like, in terms of the visuals there, some of the best CGI I've ever seen, especially in a found footage movie. It's just very, very well done. It's getting more recognition now, but I still think it's pretty underrated. The next one I'm going to be talking about is a little more controversial, I suppose, but I'm kind of in the same camp with this one. Halloween 3. Now, some people out there are going to be like, what? Halloween 3, the one that's not about Michael Myers at all? Yeah, I guess the whole idea of creating this series of vignettes following different stories, different types of horror stories, is more of something that would have provided variety than just having the constant recycle of the slasher movie over and over again, which, let's face it, isn't very good. But this one obviously didn't catch on because people were so attached to the Michael Myers story. It's understandable, but the funny thing about Halloween 3 is I think it gets a lot of hate because of that, but if you go back and watch it, it's actually a pretty terrifying movie. It's got some goofiness, of course, but the story is pretty scary. Essentially, it follows this evil corporation that's going to try and use masks to kill all these children. It's some dark stuff, man. That's some really dark stuff. It's been pretty underrated and hated for a long time. But the thing is, in recent years, it's kind of being rediscovered and like, you know what? It's really not that bad. The next one's kind of an independent horror movie. I guess it's sort of almost more of a dark romance or something. Romantic comedy. I don't know. It's kind of a fusion of genres. But it's this film called Low. Basically, this guy uses his dark magic that his girlfriend had, and he summons this portal and kind of brings himself between the worlds so he can summon this demon to him to help him communicate with his girlfriend and get her back. And the demon, of course, doesn't make it very easy and kind of tries to mess with his mind a lot, and there's some other demons involved. And it all kind of leads to this little twist, which I won't get into. This movie is really good. I think there are some tonal issues sometimes where it kind of, like I remember at one point there's like a random dance number. Yeah, it really kind of takes you out of the movie. But when this movie is creepy and dark and disturbing, which is most of the time, it works pretty well. And it's one of those examples where the low budget really kind of speaks for itself and actually works for the film. And it's just such a personal, moving, and tragic story. Like this, I guess it's uplifting in a sense, but on the whole, it's kind of a bittersweet movie. It's a little sad, but it's definitely a unique take. If there's romance horror, I guess this is sort of a perfect example of that. But really cool when I saw it. Nobody's ever really talked about this one except for like one guy I knew who was super into horror. Very, very underrated film. Definitely check it out. The next one I'm going to talk about actually is kind of a two-parter, I guess you could say. It is The Hills Have Eyes, which is, The Hills Have Eyes. Now, once again, this isn't as underrated as some films, but in the grand scheme of horror films, I don't think people really talk about The Hills Have Eyes too much. Unless, of course, you're very well versed in horror. I mean, The Hills Have Eyes is also kind of unique in that I really like the original film a lot for pushing the limit, but the remake is pretty good too. They're essentially the same film, but I guess if you check out either version, you're not really going to be doing yourself a disservice. I know they're classic movies, but I think they could deserve a little more love. Another one is The House of a Thousand Corpses. Now, Rob Zombie definitely has some of the visuals down, and he certainly makes the type of movies he wants to make, and they're very much Rob Zombie films. And House of a Thousand Corpses is still my favorite of his, just in terms of the gore, in terms of the frightening nature of these characters, kind of right out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the really crazy twist. It really does feel like you're kind of moving into some really depraved heavy metal album. That's what it feels like. And once again, good film, people know of it, but I don't think people talk about it enough. It's a really good horror movie, and I still think Rob Zombie's best. Next one I'm going to be talking about is kind of a sci-fi. It's called Communion. It's this movie about Christopher Walken, based on the books by Wheatley Strieber, I think that's his name, about alien abductions. And this is just a really unsettlingly weird movie. It's the best way that I could definitely describe it. It's just an unsettling movie. Because he apparently gets abducted. He thinks they might be messing with his family. He thinks that he might have gone crazy. Nobody believes him. And once again, some of the images of these things, they're like the most basic aliens you can imagine. But the way they're presented, it's just weird. It's a little goofy in some areas, but the whole thing has this bizarre dreamlike quality which just is a little unsettling. And it's perfect for Christopher Walken. And I think it's a little underrated for that. It's a really weird movie, but it's kind of scary. I think more people need to talk about Communion. Another one, which is a sci-fi as well, is Sphere. Now, this is a movie that I'm probably going to be talking about in the near future with somebody, actually. Now, it's more of just a general sci-fi, but I think sci-fi horror is definitely a good enough definition for it, because this movie is terrifying. Basically, there's this team of scientists that are summoned. They go into this underground base where they have discovered what looks like an alien spaceship. They go inside. There's this weird device which appears to be a giant sphere. People seem to disappear within the sphere and then come out, and then weird things start to happen, like things that shouldn't exist start existing, and people start getting killed. And it seems that they have the ability now to turn their greatest dreams and nightmares into reality. So yeah, it's pretty terrifying when you can literally shape your own reality and not have full control over what you're doing. It's a terrifying concept. The movie did not do very well. It's one of those things that I know critically didn't do well, but I find this movie to be really unnerving. I really do. And it's one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. So for me, it's definitely a favorite. Another one's much more recent. And I know that it got a lot of praise, but I want this one to go down as like a horror classic. It Follows, man, It Follows. This is one of the most unique monsters we've had in a long time, and these characters, you actually care about them. You don't know how you're going to stop this thing, and it follows you, man. It follows you. What a scary concept. What a scary concept, and done so well, and so original. Something truly fresh from horror now. We've had a couple good ones, but man, we need more horror movies like this. We really do. The next one is another sci-fi horror sort of thing, Under the Skin. You know, the one where Scarlett Johansson's an alien who takes the form of a lady and just starts going around kind of luring men and doing terrible things to them, apparently feeding on them, for some nefarious purpose we're uncertain about. This movie, of course, has more dramatic elements, but it's a very low-key movie, not much dialogue, pretty much it's sold on the visuals and the atmosphere, the music, but this is one of the most unsettling movies I've ever seen. It is just terrifying. This movie is really, really disturbing. You could say whatever you want to about the meaning behind it or how well done it was in other story elements, but this movie's disturbing. It's just an uncomfortable thing to watch, and I think it deserves to get talked about even more. Much around the same time that Under the Skin came out, there was this other film that came out called Enemy, which I guess is more of a thriller, but once again, it's kind of such a weird, surreal, disturbing film where Jake Gyllenhaal plays a guy who discovers he has a double, and the double doesn't really like the fact that he knows he has another guy that looks like him out there in the world, so they start kind of messing with each other's lives and each other's wives, and things get messy, and it kind of has a really creepy, weird ending. Enemy is a brilliant thriller. I'm not sure if it's entirely a horror film, but it horrified me, and whether or not you want to say certain things are metaphorical, certain things just kind of happen in the movie, especially towards the end. We're like, okay, there might be something supernatural here. I don't know. Maybe he lost his mind. Either way, it's disturbing. Now, as I was going through this list, I realized something. I hadn't been talking about my buddy John Carpenter, and I know John Carpenter is one of the masters of horror, but this guy has just done so many movies besides Halloween, besides The Thing, that are really awesome that nobody talks about. And I think the other ones that are part of his whole Lovecraftian trilogy, including The Prince of Darkness and Mouth of Madness, both really good films, some of my favorites of his, nobody ever talks about. They're really good movies, and I highly encourage you to check them out. I do think The Thing is the best one, but they're really good movies too. Also, Christine, I think, is one of the most faithful Stephen King adaptations, and for that alone, I think it deserves more recognition. And there are some scary things about that car, let's be honest. Now, this one, I feel like among people that do watch horror films, I think once you talk about it, people will realize, oh man, it is really scary, but no one's really talked about it, and that's The Descent. About those girls that go out hiking and they end up going into this one crevice and get stuck underground, and there's all those subterranean creatures that they have to escape from in the dark. That movie, that movie is scary. That movie is really, really scary. That movie is so scary, and people need to talk about it more. People need to talk about The Descent because that movie is frightening. Oh my goodness. Oh man, that is so scary to me. Yeah, definitely talk about The Descent. Another underrated sci-fi horror is The Cube, where these people from all different backgrounds are transported to some underground facility, which appears to be a giant cube with different rooms, and in all the rooms are varying kinds of death traps. And on top of that, all the rooms seem to move, so if there's an exit point, it would be damn near impossible to map. So it's basically these people have been put into a giant deadly rat maze, and they have to try and get out before the cube kills them, or they kill each other. Very good movie, lots of good gore, it's a really strong intensity. The sequels are not as good, but The Cube is an excellent film. Another one, Japanese horror film, Audition, where this guy puts out an audition to try and meet a nice lady, and he apparently meets the perfect woman he can start dating and might possibly marry, and she does seem like the sweetest thing, but it turns out that she's actually a psychopath that likes to lure men and do terrible things to them. It's it's kind of a disturbing film, and it's one of those films. It's all build up. We're all building up to this moment where she gets to know him better, and then it finally happens, and bad things start happening to that poor guy. Oh man, that is a frightening film. Definitely Definitely check out Audition if you guys haven't. Yo, seriously. And getting back to Stephen King adaptations, The Dead Zone, once again with Christopher Walken, really excellent film. I don't think it's as scary as some of his films, but there are some unsettling moments. The guy, of course, after getting into an accident, he has a coma, which, he comes out of it after years. His life's ruined. His girlfriend's left him. He's unhealthy. He doesn't have a job anymore, but he has the ability now to see visions of the future, and he stops a serial killer, and then eventually he has to decide whether or not he's going to stop this guy who may become president, but this guy might be unstable and might cause a nuclear devastation. So it's one of those things where it's not the most terrifying, but it is also kind of unsettling, and there are some creepy moments for sure. Some of the serial killer stuff always I thought was kind of disturbing, but very good movie. I think it's one of Christopher Walken's best, actually. Definitely go see it if you guys haven't. And the last one that I have on here is one I saw recently. It's actually a remake of The Blob. The 1988 Blob is really, really good. I was surprised, just in terms of the special effects, once again the gore, how they used the creature, how it manipulated itself, how it killed people. Really impressive stuff, and with stop motion, with maybe some early computer graphics, and just some really clever film tricks there. It does have some of that 80s cheesiness, but it's an enjoyable film. It's got some tension. It's a good 80s horror movie. I think it's definitely underrated. But yeah, guys, those were some horror movies I thought don't get quite as much love as some of the other bigger ones. Let me know if you guys thought there were some ones I missed or ones you may have seen that I haven't that you think deserve to be talked about more in the comments below. And please, if you guys ever want me to do any special videos for you of any type, you can check out my Patreon. I do videos based on donations, even a couple bucks helps. And of course, besides my channel, you can check out my website at merlinthemighty.com, or you can follow me on Facebook or Twitter. Alright, everybody. Hope you had a good Halloween, and there should be some more awesome videos for you in the future. Stay magical.